and I currently work as a project manager for the Eco Innovation Project, which is a collaborative research project based at the Faculty of Science and Engineering at the University of Chester. Prior to this role, I worked for the Icelandic government. I worked for an organisation called Innovation Centre Iceland, which sits under the Ministry of Industry and Innovation. And I worked there as a project manager, mostly focused on regional development projects and in particular on rural development. Could you swap the slides now, please? Thank you. I don't know how much you guys know about Iceland. So I thought I'd put together a few figures of sort of size and scale. I don't know how incredibly accurate these are, as I did use Wikipedia and just general Googling to find these stats, but Iceland has around about 360,000 people in the total population, which if you compare it to Shropshire is quite a bit smaller than the population of Shropshire. It's quite a big landmass and therefore incredibly sparsely populated, with a density of only 3 people per square kilometre. This can create quite a lot of problems in all sorts of areas, really. But the GDP of Iceland is about $26 billion, whereas the UK is about 2.8 trillion. I was going to find the GDP for Shropshire, but I couldn't find it. So I don't know what the comparison is with GDP. But the reason I'm talking about the size of the country is that it will become a bit clearer in a minute. So Iceland, the government in Iceland is always a coalition government. I don't think certainly not in my time, there's never been a non-coalition government. Currently we have a 3-party coalition between the Left Green movement, the Independence Party and the Progressive Party. It's a little bit of an odd mix, spanning very much from left to middle to the right. These 3 parties have an agreement, so when they form a government, they also form a coalition agreement with a list of targets and key things they want to achieve. And for this particular government, one of their targets was to achieve a complete connectivity for the whole of the country. The target is 99.9% of homes and businesses to be connected and to have access to 100 megabit per second connection. And in order to achieve this, the government has made funds available for local government and for local bodies, I suppose, to achieve and implement this. I will state though that this does not mean that the government is funding fibre for the whole country at once, because most of the country was already, of course, connected when this agreement was made. This is more for the most remote areas and the sort of smallest towns and villages that had poor connections and that were sort of being left behind with the rural connectivity. This is to make so it's by 2020, sorry, this is 2020 goals. So the government was formed in 2017, and their goals were to have the 99.9% connectivity by 2020, and they're very well on their way with that. This is a result of quite a few years of lobbying. It's not just some, political will, but it's also lobbying by rural community groups and by the most kind of remote areas. Some communities had actually gone as far as to privately fund internet connections before. So this was a very welcome development by the whole of the country, really. The motivation, I mean, the biggest problem Iceland has, same as any other country really, is urbanization. The population is, like I said, 364,000, I think, in 2020, of which 233,000 live in the capital area, in the Reykjavik area. And this is a trend in Iceland, same as everywhere else. So people are moving away from the rural areas to the urban ones. The economic crash in 2008 did change the trend a little bit. There was a spike in people moving back to rural areas and to the smaller urban areas, so to the towns and villages. Mostly it was people who were originally from those areas who were sort of moving back home and moving back with their families. Another big driver is, of course, economic. Better connectivity is vital for business everywhere, and it takes away a large hurdle for rural businesses especially. Better connectivity also enables more remote working, and jobs become less dependent on location and move more to being sort of internet-based. As we're all experiencing now with the coronavirus, this is kind of pushing the limits of home working, and many companies will probably make us all come up with new ways of working before it's all over. But in my previous role in Iceland, we used to deliver business support and training to SMEs and entrepreneurs. We used to do this online for rural businesses. So there was a huge drive. The Innovation Centre in Iceland has people based all over the country. It's usually lone working people, so we're sort of a virtual team. But what we did is used software similar to, I guess, Microsoft Teams, and there's like GoToMeetings. There's quite a lot of these collaborative platforms around, and we would use those to deliver business support and training to rural businesses in order for people not to have to travel, because quite often your nearest town or village could be an hour or two away by car. It's a bit of a long way to drive just for a couple of hours worth of training. So we used to deliver it all online. Quite often you could have a sort of interactive sessions similar to what we're doing now, with just using online. As I said before, there's a political motivation, and it took a lot of political will to achieve this. There's a whole kind of drive after all the lobbyism for a few years, because it's such a big hindrance for rural business not to have good connectivity. Educational. Iceland's, like I said, incredibly sparsely populated. There's a problem. So there's an increased demand for distance learning, both at sort of A-level level and university level. In Iceland, being such a sparsely populated country, children have to travel for education, and quite often towns and villages are losing people who have to go away to attend college and then university. So there's often a kind of population gap from the age of 16 onwards to usually to about 35 or so. So people often move away from the village and don't always come back, of course. So once you've gone to university, your jobs, etc., the opportunities are not always in rural towns, especially not for people with university education, and in particular for women with university education. So there's been a bit of a drive to try and increase access to both college education and university education, to kind of, I suppose, the older the kids are when they leave home, the more likely they are, the more likely they are to form stronger bonds to their region and to come back after university. And there's also a huge safety factor. So connectivity in Iceland is incredibly important because of just environmental hazards and volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, avalanches, winds, storms, floods, snow, etc. It's a very hostile environment. and with climate change, it's becoming even more so. So it's incredibly important to be very well connected, and this kind of cuts across to the mobile network as well. You probably have a better phone signal in the middle of nowhere in Iceland than you do in the city centre of Chester, where I live. And every year, so the emergency services depend on this connectivity and to communicate with people. They send mass texts to warn of certain areas. So when the volcanic eruption in Eyjafjallajökull, for example, there was a huge amount of toxic fumes, and so there was restrictions in the region as to when you were allowed to go outside, etc. And they would communicate with people via mass text to anyone in the area to let them know that it was not safe to be outside. And so it's incredibly important for recently with all these storms that we've been having, they kind of translate from floods over here, they translate into avalanches in Iceland. And there's been a lot of evacuations, etc., of towns and villages. And that's also very important to have that connectivity so that people know when the risks are and when they have to evacuate. But we have remote locations, so there's not always all the services based in the area, so you don't always have police and fire and coast guards, and some of these are voluntary because of there's just a lack of population. Healthcare is also another one. It's very difficult to get healthcare professionals to move to rural areas, and so healthcare provision is incredibly problematic. And that's the same in other countries as well. It's not a unique problem, but healthcare professionals and teachers, etc. It's very, very difficult to get people to move to the rural areas. They often want to live in cities and larger urban areas. And so access to expert medical staff is very difficult, specialist doctors, so counselling, psychologists, etc., speech therapy for children, all these types of things are quite difficult to access. And the Nordic Council of Ministers has made this a priority, and so there's a huge drive across all of the Nordic countries to increase access to healthcare professionals and specialist healthcare via sort of internet and online provision. So that's probably quite the sort of one of the bigger growth opportunities at the moment that are being pushed to, because as long as you've got secure systems, it's quite easy to provide a lot of service without face-to-face. So you can do it via internet, via Skype, secure portals that provide you opportunities to talk face-to-face without being in the same room. As part of this kind of drive from the government, there's also been a bit of a drive to make public sector jobs and sort of basically government jobs, I don't know if you can see this is quite small, to distribute public sector jobs and institutions throughout the country so for equal opportunities for public sector workers. And so there's, for example, the fisheries management organisation is in a rural location. Obviously the Rural Development Agency is based in a rural town. And so all these kind of different government agencies and institutions have been either moving completely or increasing the amount of remote jobs. Because quite often in some rural areas, the biggest opportunity for people, especially with university education, comes from working for government and public sector. Or it's quite often the sort of the easiest, I guess, the easiest way to move these jobs and to increase opportunities. And there's also a target for remote working, and it ties in with the Iceland connectivity. So by the end of 2021, 5% of all government jobs that are advertised are going to be advertised without location, so to be done remotely. And by the end of 2024, this will go up to 10% of all jobs. And this table I've shown you here is government jobs that are either directly government jobs, so for government organisations and institutions, or for organisations who receive the majority of their funding through government. So that's combined in this table. And you can see that it's a reasonable distribution, and this has been a drive now for the last sort of, I don't know, 10 years, and it's still ongoing. Another thing I wanted to mention, which is a different type of connectivity, is that with Iceland being very sparsely populated and remote working becoming ever increasing, I wanted to mention these so-called knowledge centres, which are very popular in rural communities in Iceland. And I've actually worked in a couple of them myself. These are sort of all over the country, and they're buildings, basically, that are designated as centres for people who either want a hot desk or want to work. A lot of these public sector organisations have only one person working in a particular town or village. And so you get lone workers, you get people who work from home, work for themselves, freelancers, etc., who don't have that kind of opportunity, I suppose, of collaborative working. And so these centres, they offer opportunities for people to come, and it's a bit like a jelly day, I suppose. You can go in and you can work either hot desk or rent an office and have a bit of a community and a bit of a, you know, sense of community. I'd like to mention this, the building in the bottom left called Nýheimar was probably one of the first ones, and it was a bit ahead of its time. It was built in 1990 by the local local authorities in the south east corner of Iceland. And what they did is they made it a building for all. So they put the local library in there and their colleges in there and also offices, etc. So that it became a sort of, there's a cafe and it's a bit of a communal building so that the people who live in the town feel like it's theirs, and that it kind of to bridge the gap of us and them. It wasn't just a public sector kind of building, but it was a building for everyone. And so it's very important. I think it's increasingly important how the communities, so they're funded, quite often they're funded by the government. They get grants, etc. But often they also rent out office space. So they rent hot desk space. They are quite often just empty buildings that are not being used for anything. They're old community halls. One of them is an old school. Some services are provided, yes. So the centres have, they offer quite often distance learning. So they have facilities there for people who are studying from universities or colleges. There's quite often sort of like webinar rooms where you can have online meetings, etc. They obviously offer internet connection, which was a big problem in the past, and so people used to go there to have a stable internet connection. But they also kind of offer often a service, so a lot of them have the lifelong learning people. The Nordic countries have maybe a slightly different public sector infrastructure. So you have most councils, it's very devolved powers, and so the councils are responsible for education up to college level, so up to A-level level, is on the responsibility of the government. Social services are responsibility of the government and the local governments. So there's also a lot of services that are provided through each sort of council, and they quite often happen in these centres. But they're often kind of like a lifeline for these little communities, as a means to kind of have a, yes, they are for commercial. So they all vary. Some of them rent out office space for private business as well, people who are freelancing and working from home who would rather have an office somewhere else. They offer events quite often. They're event space and social space as well as used to have like lectures or talks, or you know, everyone in Iceland is an author, I think. So there's always books to be launched and read from, and so it's a bit of a community hub quite often, as opposed to just. But quite often they are, like I said, they are buildings that were just empty and not being used, or they're old schools. Not all of them are purpose built, but they all kind of serve the same purpose of being a sort of a centre for either people who are lone working or freelancers, and also then some of the local services. It's also kind of a good idea because I remember I've worked in a couple of these buildings, and just getting all these different people together in the same room, you know, you have coffee together and you talk about things and you spark new ideas, and it's where innovation quite often happens. And it's also then kind of innovation in the public sector, and projects quite often happen because of collaboration, and you can apply for different funding because you're working together with different people, etc. So there's a lot that happens when you sit down with a person who is maybe doing something completely different, and so you kind of get a different understanding and a different kind of work environment, I suppose. But that was it for me. So I want to say thank you all for listening, and please continue with the questions. Nordic Noir, yes. I think 1 in 10 people in Iceland is a published author, so it's a real thing. So if there's no other questions, I'll hand you back over to Vicky.
Thanks, Tinna. Oh, you got another question, Tinna. How do you balance work life and home life?
I'm guessing that's your meaning as a nation rather than me, or do you mean? There's a very good balance of home life and work life. I think Nordic countries are generally very good with this. So there's quite a huge drive now to shorten the work week. Everyone wants a 4-day week. There's a usually certainly in Iceland anyway, if you need to if you need to bring your kids to work, you bring your kids to work. In my old place that I used to work for, the Innovation Centre, they have their headquarters in Reykjavik, for example, and in that headquarters there was a special room where you could sit and work, but it's like a playroom for kids, but with computers, so you could watch your kids playing but still get on and do some of your work. So it is very kind of open. There's not a lot of issues with the work and home balance. It's usually quite good. So let me have a look. I've got there are things to learn from hubs. There's definitely things to learn from hubs. It's also I could go on and on about the hubs, especially about Nýheimar. It used to function as a sort of a rural hub, and there was a lot of public sector people there for some reason, and we did a lot of kind of holistic rural development as a result. So it was focused on research, on innovation, on education, and on culture, and those 4 pillars were kind of the pillars that the hubs were founded on. And so it's about building a confidence as well, and building up rural areas, because quite often people who live in rural areas have less confidence, are less proud of where they live. There's all kinds of things you can go into, which people were used to do in the hubs quite regularly. Where are we? Teaching and learning, teaching and working online. I'm not sure, Dr. Morn Kappa, if I understand your question. Is it possible to travel the roads? Steve asks. Some of them, yes. Some of them, no. In that, like this last winter, there have been times when the whole country's been closed, so not a single road has been accessible because of snow and weather. So working from home is quite a common thing in Iceland, simply because you just can't leave your house. What would your tips be for all of us now working from home? Routine, I think, is quite important. It's very easy to get distracted. If you're not used to working from home, I think for me, I like to get dressed and to get up and to, to like go through my usual routine, same as if I was going to work, and then sort of split my day into sections of work and then have a break and then have some more work and then have another break, and make sure you do exercise and go outside and have some sunshine, and it's quite easy to get distracted by the house and your home. Besides benefits of broadband, yes, so smart cities and IoT. I don't know enough about it to answer your questions, but I do know that yes, that it is being used, and it's a big thing. Technology is very big in Iceland, and I didn't mention, but I should mention that we are all incredibly connected, and all our services are online. So every person in Iceland has an ID number, and we all have a digital ID. So you have a digital ID. It can be either on your phone, on your smartphone, linked to your SIM card, or it can be a card reader that you plug into your computer. And with that, you can access all of your services. So your online banking, my taxes, my health records, my local council, bills for council tax, etc. Everything like that is accessible. If you're a parent, all your kids' school stuff is on. Anything that is in the public, that is public sector, is all accessible online through portals that the government has, which are accessible with this digital ID. It makes life very, very, very simple. So like my pet peeve for living in the UK is if you move house, you have to change your address in 7,000 places, which, I'm not used to, because in Iceland you have a legal address, you change it once where you move, and then all databases access that kind of central database of legal addresses, and it just updates automatically once a month or something. So you don't have to worry about these things. So we are a lot more online and connected, and sort of have been for quite a long time. And I think that's true of all the Nordic countries. They're very, very kind of digital. Benefit of broadband, yes, okay. Buildings for all policy. It has, of course, been affected by the virus, because now no one's allowed to go anywhere. I think they just announced this morning that they're stopping all public gatherings. It was, I think, everyone, up to 20 people, but now I think it's just been stopped. And so, of course, that will affect all the buildings as well. Everything's being affected with the virus. So everything's being affected by the virus, and no one's allowed to go anywhere, of course, so we're all working from home, which means it's good to have good broadband connections. Does the online ID? No, actually, it doesn't really raise privacy concerns. I think partly because we're all just so used to it. It's always been the way. We've always had this kind of online, or these kind of IDs. We're a very, very small country. I think that also helps. A small population where you kind of know everybody, and you're probably related to most of them anyway. There's not a lot to hide, and not a lot of places to hide. So I think the privacy issue becomes more of a concern in a larger population. I know all of the Nordic countries have a similar system. This is not an Icelandic system. It's the same in Norway, Sweden, Denmark. We all have these things, these online IDs. I'm not sure if it's that easy to crack. Probably, I don't know. But we there is competition and provision for broadband. Not a huge amount of competition, I must admit, because it's such a small population. but there is some competition, and these things get tendered on a European level as well, because we're part of the EEA, and so we tender for certain size projects through OJU, same as all EU countries. So that kind of makes the competition broader, of course, wider. I hope I've answered all your questions. If you have any more questions, you can also just contact the CREST team. So, okay, if there's no more questions, then I'll just say thank you very much and hand you back to Vicky.
Thanks very much, Tinna. There's lots of good questions there. Thank you, everybody. I'm just trying to bring up the final slide, which is... Oh, I didn't want that to start, but there you go. I was just trying to bring up the last slide, which is about our next digital smart rural, which is next Monday, the 30th of March, which will be with Noman, and we're looking at smart cities v smart rural. Noman's the digital construction lead at Balfour Beatty, so he has a lot of experience in working with smart cities and IoT technology. I have recorded this presentation and I will be making it available at some point, but you can also access the PowerPoints through crest@ucshrewsbury.ac.uk if you would like them. Thank you everybody for joining us this morning. Sorry if it was a bit of a bumpy ride, we'll get better as we go on, and I look forward to meeting you all next week. I'm going to close the meeting now. Thank you everybody for your contributions.